morning began with a question no man expected to face after a decade of silence. How much blood does it take to break a life that has already been broken? Elias Granger stood at the edge of his weather-beaten porch, the cool breath of dawn brushing against his face, carrying dust, dry grass, and the same lonely wind that had kept him company for years. He had woken, as he always did, to the creak of the old house settling beneath its own memories. Nothing ever changed out here. Nothing dared to. But the land had its own way of shifting beneath a man's feet. And on this morning, it shifted with the color red. The streak caught his eye before the fear did. A jagged smear of blood across the eastern fence line, dragged in a direction no stray calf or wounded coyote would choose. Elias stopped breathing for a moment, not because he was afraid, but because he recognized trouble when the earth whispered it. The prairie had seen violence. He had too. But he'd sworn off the kind that walked on two legs. Yet the sight of that crimson trail stirred something sharp inside him, something he thought he had buried under years of self-imposed exile. He grabbed his rifle out of habit, not intention, and followed the trail across the hard-pan dirt. The wind pressed the tall grass in uneven waves, as if trying to cover the path someone had crawled through. 30 yards from the fence, he saw a collapsed bundle of fabric, pale blue cotton, torn and dusted, trembling with a shallow rise and fall. His heartbeat thickened, and he moved faster. Lena Mercer looked impossibly small against the endless land. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked dark around the hip, where a deep wound pulsed slow, failing drips of blood. Her face was streaked with sweat and grit, lashes wet with the kind of fear that scraped a soul raw. When her eyes opened, they snapped to Elias like a frightened animal trying to understand whether the shadow looming over her meant salvation or death. "Please," her voice cracked, raw and desperate. "Don't let them take me back." The words hit harder than the sight of her wound. Elias knelt, letting the rifle drop beside him. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as if she feared the earth might swallow her whole if she let go. He felt her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. "No one's taking you anywhere," he said, steady but soft, the way he used to speak when calming dying horses. "You're safe for now." Her breath hitched, relief and terror tangled in it. The prairie stretched around them, wide and merciless. But in that small circle of quiet between two strangers, something fragile sparked. A trust born not from time, but from need. Elias lifted her with the ease of a man who had once carried bodies heavier than guilt. She held on to him, her face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in short gasps as pain stabbed through her. Each step back toward the house felt heavier than the last, not because of her weight, but because he knew, with every instinct honed across old battlefields and darker memories, that whatever had chased her here was not finished. Inside the cabin, the shadows shifted with their entrance. Elias laid her on the worn leather couch and moved with brisk, controlled precision. He cleaned the wound with cold water and whiskey, his hands unshaking even as her body arched from the sting. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to cry out. The fight in her was fierce, wild, the kind that survived when everyone else had died. As he wrapped the wound with clean strips of cloth, he felt her gaze on him, searching, measuring, trying to decide if she had traded one danger for another. Elias wished he had answers to offer, something gentler than the truth that danger tended to follow blood, and now her blood stained his fence. "You're going to be all right," he murmured, tightening the bandage. "Rest now. We'll talk when you can breathe easier." For a moment, her eyes softened, the storm inside them easing just enough for gratitude to flicker through. Then exhaustion claimed her, pulling her under. Elias stood, exhaling slowly as he looked out the window toward the fence line. The land lay still, But he knew stillness did not mean safety. Something had driven Lena Mercer across miles of unforgiving country. Something ruthless, determined, and close enough that she had reached his home only by a thread. He closed the curtains and locked the door, listening as her breathing steadied behind him. The old house seemed to hold its breath too. The question lingered, heavy and unwelcome. What force was cruel enough to hunt a girl until she bled across another man's land? And how long until it reached his door? The prairie had given him a mystery in the shape of a wounded woman, and Elias felt the weight of it settle into his bones. He had left the world to forget the things he'd done, the violence he'd sworn off. But the world, it seemed, had found him anyway, and it had brought a bleeding girl to his fence to pull him back in. Elias woke before Lena finished her first long sleep, the kind that comes when the body has been stripped raw and the mind allows itself a reprieve. He sat at the small kitchen table, tin cup warming nothing, watching light crawl across floorboards. He had heard confessions by campfires and in interrogation rooms. He knew how fear arranges facts. When Lena finally spoke, she did it with the careful economy of someone who had watched too many die. Her family's claim near Silver Mesa had been humble until a survey turned up a rich vein. Men like Colt Dawson came with smiles that were promises and a ledger of favors. Dawson didn't bludgeon chaos. He bought complicity, hired muscle, and arranged clean nights when houses burned and people did not wake. Lena described raids, the house set to flame, her brother tackling a foreman until he was dragged away, her mother pulled from a hiding place and beaten. She spared nothing important. Elias listened without interruption, feeling the story sink into him, not as rumor, but as a map of intent. This was not random cruelty. It was a plan with names and timings, and men who understood how to move power without leaving easy trails. Lena spoke of Connolly, a drunken foreman who kept receipts and a crude ledger in his bunkhouse under a loose board. She'd seen Connolly brag. She'd seen the ledger once and remembered the dates that matched the nights they came. It was a tiny detail that felt like a seam in a stitched-up hide. The severity of the threat made Elias's solitude feel less a choice than a wound. Colt Dawson was more than a bully. He was a man who could twist lawmen and ranchers until they stood in line. The county sheriff could be bought, deputies could be silenced. In towns like these, fear had a price, and greed paid it well. If Dawson had men who could erase a family, he would erase anyone who stood between him and the claim. Lena did not speak of vengeance. She spoke of survival and of the ledger, because survival needs witnesses, and witnesses need proof. She told Elias the mornings when her father would walk the claim line and talk to the land, the way her brother whistled when he fixed a fence, the scent of soap her mother used on winter nights. These small domestic truths made the violence more than headlines. They made it theft of a life. When she finished, silence settled like dust. Elias felt the task pressing against the edges of what he had sworn to be. A man who kept his hands to his property and his past to himself. Names had fallen like pebbles into deep water. Connolly, Dawson, a deputy named Harlan who owed a debt. Each pebble sending ripples. If Connolly kept that ledger, if a scrap of paper tied a man to a killing, then Colt's gilded story could be pried open. "Why did they leave you?" Elias asked. The question came softer than he'd planned. "They wanted to make it look like bandits," Lena said. "But Connolly messes up when he's drunk. He keeps things he shouldn't. My brother saw him once. He said Connolly keeps receipts and names. If someone finds that, Colt's story falls apart." A cold, precise calculation clicked into Elias's mind. He had been a man of action once, and knew how to make hard calls. Solitude had dulled his appetite for risk, but not his competence. Evidence was leverage. Leverage forced cracks. If there was proof, if Connolly's ledger existed, The violence that had chased Lena could be pinned to a face. A face pinned to paper could become a chain that pulled others loose. Lena watched him with a careful, fragile hope. "Why help me?" she asked finally, the question stripped of accusation and built of need. Elias considered the ways a man answers when his own peace is broken. "Because someone used to bring me boys who needed a hand," he said. "Because I know what it is to be left for dead." He left the rest, failures and names buried in his mind, unspoken. The prairie had given him quiet, but it had not given him numbness. He rose and moved to the window, staring at the fence line where Lena had crawled. The horizon was a promise and a threat. It made plans look possible and lies look inevitable. "Tomorrow," he said, "we rest. Then we go to Connolly's bunkhouse. Quiet. We take what proves things, bring it to a man who'll read it and not cash Colt's favors." Lena nodded, relief and terror braided together on her face. In the thin light of the cabin, they formed a pact born of necessity. Hers to live, his to answer. Beyond the door, the prairie waited with its indifferent sky and its cattle grazing as if nothing had happened. Inside, the ledger of one family's life lay folded into memory and grit. And for the first time in years, Elias felt obligation settle like a tool in his hand. He bound the rag tighter, checked the supplies, and listened to Lena sleep. The truth she'd told him was not only a map of crime, it was a summons. Solitude had been his refuge, but the land had other plans. It had brought a girl with a memory and a wound, and expected him to choose. Elias knew the choice's shape as well as anyone who had lived with secrets. Either tend to the life in front of him or let it be swallowed whole. He did not yet know the cost, only that the cost existed. Outside, a wind picked up and the house settled with it. Inside, two people who had been strangers arranged themselves for the work ahead, the ledger's promise resting between them like a quiet ember. They would have to move carefully. The prairie had ears, and Colt Dawson had teeth. For now, they had words and a plan small enough to bend around danger. For now, that would have to be enough. The first sign wasn't sound, but a stillness, the kind that settles before a storm breaks. Elias stood at the sink, rinsing dried blood from his hands, when he felt the air shift. The prairie wind, usually restless, paused as if it sensed what approached long before human ears could catch it. He dried his palms slowly, listening. Then he heard it, the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves, several riders, moving together, not drifting cowhands, not passers-by, men with purpose. He turned toward Lena, who sat propped on the couch, her bandaged side rising with shallow breaths. The color had returned to her face, just enough to remind him she was young, too young to have seen what she had described. Her eyes lifted at the same moment as the hooves grew louder. She didn't ask who it was. Her body already knew. "Down," Elias said quietly. "Now." Fear flashed in her eyes, but she didn't argue. He pulled back the edge of the old woven rug and lifted the wooden hatch beneath it. Dust drifted from the hinges as he propped it open. The smell of earth rose from the dark, narrow space below. Lena hesitated only a second, then lowered herself inside with a tight breath, clutching the small lantern he handed her. Elias paused, meeting her gaze before he pulled the hatch closed. "No sound," he whispered. "No matter what you hear." She nodded, her jaw set with a determination that did not match her trembling hands. The hatch dropped into place, and the rug settled back over it just as the hooves reached the yard. Elias straightened his shirt, set the rifle casually by the doorframe, and took a long breath that felt like stepping into an old skin he never wanted to wear again. Shadows passed across the window, then the unmistakable crunch of boots in dry soil. 4 of them. He opened the door before they could bang on it. The man in front wore a tan coat, dusted with the long road. His face bore the kind of confidence that came from getting away with too much for too long. He smirked at Elias as though greeting an old acquaintance he had every right to intimidate. His hand rested near his holster, fingers relaxed but ready. "Morning," the man said. "We're looking for someone." Elias leaned a shoulder against the door, giving nothing. "I'm not." A couple of the men behind the leader chuckled. The leader didn't. He eyed the yard, the windows, the mended fence, then Elias again. "Girl came through this way. Hurt, bleeding bad. Our boss wants her found. Dangerous type." Elias's voice stayed even. "Dangerous folks don't crawl for miles losing blood like a stuck hog. Depends who she's dangerous to," the man said. "Mind if we look around?" "Yes," Elias said. The man smiled, the kind of smile made for trouble. That wasn't a question. Elias stepped aside half an inch, just enough to make his refusal clear. "Then you're gonna have yourself a problem." Tension snapped through the air, tight as a wire. The men drew closer, boots scraping, hands brushing the grips of their guns. The lead man peered past Elias into the cabin, eyes narrowing when he noticed a second cup on the table. A soft creak beneath the house interrupted the silence. Barely audible, but Lena's weight shifting had betrayed her. Elias saw the moment the gunman's suspicion sharpened. The man lifted his chin. "Move." Elias didn't. The lead gunman shoved past him, and Eli's hand shot out. Not for the man, but for his own rifle propped against the wall. The room exploded into motion. The gunman spun, hand flying to his holster. Elias fired first. The blast shook dust from the rafters. The lead man dropped in the doorway, collapsing backward onto the porch with a heavy thud. For a single breath, the world held still. Then the other 3 opened fire. Bullets tore into the house, splintering wood, shattering jars on the shelf. Elias ducked behind the table as shards of glass flew past him. The air filled with gunpowder and the sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline. He returned fire with 2 quick shots, forcing the men to dive behind the woodpile and water trough. "You fools don't want to do this." Elias shouted over the gunfire, though he knew they did. Men who rode for Dawson didn't back down because someone told them to. They backed down only when they were dead or paid enough to walk away. Another volley blasted through the window, showering the room with broken glass. A bullet grazed Elias's shoulder, burning like a heated brand. He hissed, but stayed low. He needed to keep them away from the house, away from the rug, away from the faint sound of Lena trying not to cry out. He checked his ammo. Not enough to hold them off forever. Outside, one of the gunmen called out, "We know she's in there. Dawson's gonna pay double for her alive." Elias swore under his breath. They weren't guessing. They knew. Someone had tracked her bleeding trail straight to his fence. Maybe they'd followed every sign she'd left along the way. Maybe they had dogs. Maybe they simply weren't in the habit of losing things that Dawson wanted. He moved to the back door, kicking it open as bullets peppered the front wall. The barn sat 50 yards away, and the space between them felt like a killing field. He sprinted anyway. Shouts rose behind him. Shots cracked through the open air. Dirt exploded at his heels. Elias reached the barn in a rush, diving behind the stack of crates where he kept the remnants of his old past, the tools from the mine, the explosives he never got around to disposing of. He didn't want to use them. But he also didn't want Lena to die in a hole under his house. He grabbed 2 sticks of dynamite, wrapped them tight, and struck a match with trembling but sure fingers. Sparks flared. The fuse hissed. Elias stepped out just long enough to lob the bundle toward the woodpile, where 2 men were taking cover. The explosion tore across the yard in a violent roar, ripping wood into splinters and shaking the ground. One man vanished under the blast. The other screamed and scrambled away, limping, half blind from dust and flame. The last gunman hesitated, torn between finishing Elias and saving his wounded partner. He chose survival and fled, thundering into the distance with the injured man slumped over his saddle. Silence rolled back over the homestead in uneven breaths. Elias waited another minute before returning to the house. The front doorway was a ruin of shattered wood and blood. Smoke curled from the yard. He pushed aside debris and lifted the rug. Lena's wide eyes stared up at him, brimming with terror and relief. "It's over for now," he said, voice low but steady. "But Dawson will know what happened." She climbed out slowly, clutching the edge of his shirt for balance. Her gaze shifted to the body on the porch, then to the smoke still rising outside. "You risked everything," she whispered. "Didn't have much left to risk," he said. "Besides, you came to my fence. That makes you my problem." But as he looked out at the wreckage, at the trail the surviving men would take back to Colt Dawson, Elias knew this was no longer a contained fight. He had stepped out of the quiet life he built and into the crosshairs of a powerful man. The hunters had found his home, and now the hunt would turn back on him. The prairie carried the smell of smoke long after the explosion faded, drifting across the homestead like a warning that refused to dissolve. Elias remained crouched behind the barn's open door, muscles locked, lungs burning from the sprint and the gunfight. The world had narrowed to the crackle of settling debris, the ache in his shoulder, and the sharp knowledge that the two surviving gunmen wouldn't retreat far. Men like them didn't flee out of fear. They fled to regroup. He scanned the horizon. Dust clouds blurred the distance where the riders had escaped, but the smear of movement was wrong. Too slow. They weren't leaving. They were circling. Elias felt the realization click into place like the cocking of a rifle. They meant to flank him, drive him from cover, and finish what they'd started. They'd lost one man to the blast. Pride alone would drag them back into the fight. And Dawson's orders would make retreat feel like a death sentence of its own. Inside the cabin, Lena waited, injured, scared, and trapped with nothing but the thin floorboards and a hatch to shield her. Elias couldn't wait for the gunmen to come to him. If he did, the fight would collapse into the house, wood walls turning into splintered coffins. He needed to take the battle away from her. He checked the pockets of his coat. 2 more sticks of dynamite. Fuses short enough to work fast, long enough to throw. One final gamble in a morning that had already stretched the limits of his luck. He tucked the explosives under his arm, grabbed his rifle, and slipped out the barn side entrance, keeping low as he moved through the tall grass. The prairie sun climbed higher, turning the air hot and metallic. Sweat ran into Elias's eyes. His breath came steady, trained by years he no longer cared to remember. He circled wide, cutting toward the dry creek bed that curved around his property. From there, he could gain elevation and catch the gunmen before they finished closing their noose. He reached the ridge just as the first rider appeared below, weaving through scrub brush with a rifle slung in one hand. The injured man rode behind him, hunched and bleeding, eyes scanning wild for movement. Elias steadied himself on a rock, heart slowing, making each breath count. He could shoot them now. 1 bullet each, clean, quiet. But a gunshot carried for miles. Dynamite did too, but it buried the evidence. He pulled the first stick free, struck the match against his boot heel, and lit the fuse. The hiss was soft, almost calm. Elias waited 2 seconds, judging the wind, the arc, the distance. Then he threw. The dynamite spun end over end, a flicker of fire trailing from its fuse. The gunman saw it too late. The explosion ripped through the dry creek bed, a thunderous blast that sent dirt, rocks, and shrapnel flying. The lead horse bucked violently, throwing its rider to the ground. The wounded man screamed and toppled sideways, tangled in his saddle. Elias didn't look away. He couldn't afford hesitation. The second stick was already in his hand, the match already struck. He aimed for the cluster of brush where the surviving rider crawled for cover. Another throw, another violent eruption. Dust swallowed everything for a moment. Horses screaming, soil raining from above, the air trembling with aftershocks. When the haze cleared, Elias counted only one rider still moving, dragging himself across the dirt with a broken leg and a look in his eyes that had nothing human left. Elias descended the ridge slowly, rifle raised. The wounded gunman reached for the pistol at his hip, but pain dragged him down again. His voice rasped, thick with hatred and desperation. "He'll find you," the man spit out. "Mr. Dawson, he won't stop." Elias stopped several feet away. He didn't answer. The threat wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. It was simply confirmation of the truth he had already embraced. The moment he'd stepped into this fight, he'd stepped onto a road that led straight to Colt Dawson's door. The wounded man's hand twitched toward his pistol. Elias fired once. The gunman slumped back into the dust. Still, silence reclaimed the prairie. Elias took a long breath, lowering his rifle as he surveyed the wreckage. The ground was cratered where the blasts had torn through it. Splintered saddles lay half-buried. A half-dead horse limped past him, lost and panicked. He put it down with a quiet, merciful shot. Then he turned toward home. As he approached the cabin, he saw the front door partially ajar, hanging crooked on shattered hinges. The porch boards were splattered with dried blood. He stepped inside cautiously, scanning the corners. The room was still. Only the settling dust moved. He walked to the center of the floor and pulled back the rug. The hatch opened with a low groan. Lena stared up with wide eyes, gripping the lantern so tightly her knuckles were white. Her voice trembled. "Are they gone?" "For now," Elias said, "but that won't last." She climbed out slowly, careful of her wound, and stood in the dim light of the cabin. Her gaze drifted to the scorch marks on the walls, the bullet holes, the debris scattered across the floor. The fear in her eyes deepened. Not just fear of death, but fear of the power hunting her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You didn't ask for any of this." Elias shook his head. "Doesn't matter what I asked for. Trouble stepped onto my land. I dealt with it. But Dawson won't quit," she said, her voice almost breaking. "No," Elias admitted, "he won't." He met her gaze, and something shifted between them. Not quite trust, not quite partnership, but a recognition that their fates had intertwined in a way neither could undo. His quiet life was gone. The land he had chosen for solitude had turned into a battleground. And Lena, the girl he'd found bleeding by his fence, had become the thread pulling him toward a reckoning he hadn't wanted, but now couldn't avoid. He cleaned his rifle, reloaded, and tightened the bandage on his shoulder. Lena watched him with a mixture of awe and worry. "What now?" she asked. Elias looked out at the horizon, where dust from the explosion still drifted. "Now," he said, "we take the fight somewhere else, somewhere he won't expect." He didn't say where. He didn't need to. They both knew the next step would drag them closer to Dawson, closer to the truth, and closer to whatever end waited for them on the trail ahead. The prairie wind picked up, carrying away the smoke. The reckoning had started, and Elias would not be the one running. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Elias realized the quiet around the homestead no longer felt like safety. It felt like a countdown. Smoke still stained the edges of the yard, a faint reminder of how close death had come. The prairie, usually so wide and indifferent, now seemed to listen, waiting for the next hoofbeat, the next intrusion, the next piece of violence that Colt Dawson would inevitably send. Elias had held off the hunters, but he knew better than to believe the fight ended here. If Dawson's men didn't return by nightfall, Dawson himself would come looking for answers. And when that happened, this land, this house, and the fragile bit of safety Lena had found would burn to ash. Inside the cabin, Lena leaned against the table, pale but steady. She had slept only a little, her rest broken by nightmares and the echo of explosions still ringing in her mind. She watched Elias as he packed supplies, water, jerky, a few cartridges, and the battered journal he hadn't touched in years. "You're really leaving," she said softly. Not accusatory, just afraid. An admission of how deep her uncertainty ran. "Not leaving you," Elias said as he cinched the last strap. "Leaving here. Dawson will come, and this house won't survive another fight." Lena pressed her lips together, her eyes searching his face. "Where are we going?" Elias took a slow breath, choosing his words as if each one mattered more than the last. "To the county seat, to the law. Someone with enough backbone to listen to your story and enough distance from Dawson's money to believe it." "What if they don't?" she asked, voice fragile. "Then we find someone who does." It was a promise he had no right to make, but he made it anyway. Because standing idle while she carried the weight of a massacre wasn't something he could do. Not anymore. He saw her fighting the answer in her mind, trying to push down every memory Colt Dawson had carved into her life. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "I'm slowing you down. You're alive," Elias said. "That's the only thing that matters." He stepped outside and saddled his horse, a calm, aging bay named Scout. Lena followed, wincing as she moved. She tried to hide the pain. Elias saw it anyway. The morning air brushed against them, colder than usual, as though the world itself understood the fragile thread they were about to walk. When he helped her into the saddle, she hesitated for just a moment, fingers tightening on his forearm. "I wouldn't have survived without you," she said quietly. "I know that." Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure he knew how. His life had been built on silence. Silence from grief, from guilt, from the world he had abandoned. And now a girl he barely knew was turning that silence into responsibility. They rode out slowly, leaving the broken homestead behind. The fence line where Elias had first found her was still stained faintly red. Lena looked away as they passed it, shoulders tensing. "Don't look back," Elias murmured. She nodded, though the memory clung to her like dust. Half a mile out, the prairie widened, giving them a clear view of the open land stretching toward the county seat. But Elias's eyes weren't on the horizon. They were on the small trail of tracks that cut across the grass. Fresh, deep, and far too many to be coincidence. Dawson's reinforcements had already swept through the area. He slowed Scout to a stop. Lena's breath caught. "What is it?" "Tracks," he said. "A lot of them. They're riding hard. Probably ahead of us now, maybe headed toward the town." Lena's fear sharpened. "Dawson's going to the law first. Or he's buying them off," Elias said. The phrase made something cold settle in his chest. "We need a different path." They veered south, deeper into the prairie, riding through brush and over dry creek beds. Hours passed under the climbing sun. Lena leaned against him as fatigue pulled at her, her injury aching with each jolt. Elias steadied her, one arm wrapped around her waist when necessary. He tried to ignore the way her trust warmed something inside him he hadn't felt in years. A tether he didn't expect, didn't want, but couldn't deny. Near midday, they reached a lonely ridge overlooking the wide valley that led toward the county seat. And there, slicing through the valley floor like a dark vein, Elias saw them. 6 riders in a tight formation, moving fast, dust rising behind them. Dawson's men, headed straight toward town. "They'll reach the sheriff long before we do," Elias muttered. "If Dawson gets his version of the story in first, the law may turn on us before we even get through the door. So what do we do?" Lena whispered. Elias stared at the riders below, jaw tightening. We go to someone the law listens to. Someone Dawson hasn't bought yet. Who? Judge Hollis, Elias said. He's old, stubborn, and too proud to take a bribe from a man like Dawson. If anyone will hear you out, it's him. Lena's hope flickered cautiously. Can he protect us? He can put Dawson under a noose if the ledger exists, and if we get to him alive. The road to Hollis's ranch was longer, rougher, and full of places a man could disappear forever. Elias knew this land better than most, but even he couldn't predict every danger. They were small figures riding through a vast land, hunted by men with no conscience and led by a man with everything to lose. Lena suddenly swayed in the saddle. Elias caught her before she slipped, her body going limp for a moment. Hey, he said, voice low, steadying her. Stay with me. I'm just tired, she whispered weakly. You've lost a lot of blood. We stop soon. She shook her head stubbornly. No, if we stop, they'll catch us. Elias looked at her pale face, at the wound he'd bound as tightly as he dared. The desperation in her voice was real. So was the fear lingering under it. But pushing her too hard could kill her faster than any bullet. He slowed the horse, shifting her weight against his chest. You rest, he said. I'll keep Scout moving. Lena didn't argue that time. Her head pressed lightly against his shoulder, breath warm despite the cold air. He felt the fragility of her life in every shallow inhalation. The quiet ride gave Elias time to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. For years he'd believed his isolation was strength, an armor that kept him from causing harm or receiving it. But now, as he held Lena upright in the saddle, the lie of that solitude became painfully clear. A man could run from people, but he couldn't run from responsibility. Not forever. The prairie wind brushed across them, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Elias tightened his grip on the reins, his free arm wrapped protectively around Lena. He was no longer riding for himself. He was riding for her, and that meant he couldn't afford to fail. Ahead lay judgment, danger, and the shadow of Colt Dawson growing larger by the hour. Behind them lay gunmen, smoke, and the ruins of the quiet life Elias once believed he could keep forever. The storm was coming. Elias was done hiding from it. The valley lay washed in the gold of late afternoon when Elias and Lena finally approached Judge Hollis's ranch. The house rose from the land with the stubborn dignity of a man who'd resisted time and corruption for decades. Windmills creaked, cattle grazed lazily, and a pair of ranch hands paused their work long enough to stare at the strangers riding in. Elias kept one arm firm around Lena, feeling her pulse flutter against him like a faint, unsteady rhythm fighting to hold on. Judge Hollis stepped out onto the porch before Elias could dismount. His white hair glowed in the dying light, and his posture, straight-backed, unbending despite age, was exactly as Elias remembered. Hollis had always carried the authority of a man who believed the truth carried more weight than bullets. Granger? Hollis called, surprise narrowing his eyes. Lord help us, what trouble found you after all these years? Elias swung down and caught Lena before she slipped from the saddle. The kind that leaves bodies in my yard, he said. We need your help, and we don't have long. Hollis's eyes sharpened at the sight of Lena's blood-stained dress and pallor. Bring her inside. Within minutes. Lena lay on a clean guest bed while Hollis's daughter, a former nurse, examined her wound. Elias stood at the doorway, his hands clenched, the long trail of the past days pressing into his bones. Hollis waited beside him, arms crossed, gaze steady. Tell me everything, the judge said. Elias did. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, of Lena's family, the massacre, Colt Dawson's ambition, the ledger Connolly kept, and the gunmen who hunted them. Hollis listened with the stillness of a man measuring each detail. When Elias finished, the judge exhaled slowly. I warned the county council about Dawson years ago, Hollis said. told them a man who buys friends also buys enemies. They didn't listen. "Will they listen now?" Elias asked. "They'll have to," Hollis said, "because I will force them." He straightened, resolve hardening in his voice. "We ride at first light. I'll swear statements from you both, and I'll send word to the marshal's office in Carson Bluff. They won't ignore this." For the first time in days, a thin thread of relief uncoiled inside Elias. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was a path. Night settled across the ranch, calm but heavy. Elias checked on Lena once more. She lay awake, eyes half open, a faint steadiness returning to her breath. When she saw him, she tried to smile. "Are we safe?" she whispered. "For tonight," Elias said. "Tomorrow we finish this." She reached slightly toward him, fingers brushing his hand. "Thank you for not letting me die out there." Elias swallowed the knot in his throat. "Rest now, Lena. You earned it." But as he walked outside, the quiet gnawed at him. He stood on the porch under a sky dusted with stars, listening to the deep, steady hum of the land. The prairie didn't care about human fears or failures, but tonight it felt gentler, as if offering a brief mercy before the next storm. At dawn, Hollis's ranch bustled with motion. Deputies loyal to the judge gathered, armed and ready to escort them into town. Lena sat upright in the wagon, pale but determined. She refused to stay behind. Elias rode beside her, watchful, every sense sharpened. When they reached the county seat, the air crackled with tension. Dawson's men lingered near the saloon, whispering in tight circles. The sheriff and 2 deputies stood stiff by the courthouse steps, their faces guarded. But when Judge Hollis mounted the platform, the entire street quieted. He spoke with the slow, deliberate authority only age and righteousness could command. He named the crimes, the deaths, the attempted murder on Elias's land. He announced the arrival of a witness, the last Mercer. And finally, he declared that he had summoned federal marshals who would arrive within days. Colt Dawson, standing on the balcony above the saloon, went rigid with fury. His jaw clenched, fingers curling over the railing. But under the judge's watchful stare and the gathered crowd, he could do nothing. Not here. Not today. Dawson's power cracked in a single moment. The moment he lost control of the narrative. The days that followed moved in a blur. Deputies located Connolly's ledger exactly where Lena said it would be. The names and payments spelled out in damning ink. Witnesses, once too terrified to speak, stepped forward under Hollis's protection. The marshals arrived, and Dawson was dragged from his office in irons, raging and spitting like a cornered wolf. When he passed Elias and Lena, he snarled, "This ain't over." Elias held his gaze. "For you it is." The trial took weeks. The verdict took minutes. Afterward, the town shifted, slowly, cautiously, into something lighter. The air lost the edge of fear. People spoke Lena's name with a mix of sorrow and respect. And though nothing would give her back what she had lost, the truth had been set down in law. Justice, imperfect as it was, had carved open a path for her future. When it was finally over, Elias and Lena rode back to the homestead, the land still scarred from the battle. Burned grass, splintered boards, the memory of gunfire echoing in the quiet. But the house still stood, the fence still framed the horizon, and the prairie wind, once sharp with threat, now carried only dust and sun. Lena walked the length of the fence, stopping at the spot where Elias first found her. She touched the wood gently. "It feels different," she said. "It is different," Elias replied. She turned to him, eyes soft but no longer broken. "What will you do now?" Elias considered the land, the wreckage, the stillness he once clung to like a shield. "I'll rebuild, fix what's left, Maybe make room for what's new. Lena stepped closer. Do you want me to stay? Elias hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of the fragile weight of the moment. He'd lived half a life in silence, and here was someone who had walked through fire with him, asking for something simple and impossible at once. Yes, he said quietly, if you want to. Lena smiled, small, warm, healing. I do. The land around them seemed to exhale. No gunmen, no smoke, no ghosts, but the kind a person learns to live with. The prairie had turned honest again, and in that honesty, Elias Granger and Lena Mercer found something neither expected. Not peace, exactly, but a beginning. The prairie settled into its quiet rhythm again, stretching out beneath a wide, forgiving sky. For the first time in a long while, Elias walked his land without listening for distant gunfire or counting the shadows that didn't belong. The danger had passed, not without scars, but scars had their own kind of truth. Lena felt it too, the shift in the air, the way the wind no longer carried fear. She moved through the homestead with a steadier step, her breaths no longer shaped by dread, and each sunrise softened something inside her that grief had hardened. They spoke little, because little was needed. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It drifted in like morning light, touching everything slowly. Sometimes Elias fixed a fence, while Lena sat nearby, letting the warmth of the day settle into her bones. Sometimes they walked the fields in silence, sharing the quiet as if it were a language. Neither knew what the future promised, only that they no longer faced it alone. Out here, where the land was honest again, two wounded lives learned to rest, to breathe, and to begin. End of article. Good night.